have
So
to say.
Seb, we gotta get you to weigh in on this. Drake, Kendrick, where do we stand? What's the right move here?
I'm, I'm so sorry, Dex. I have no opinion. I haven't even. I don't even know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, I have zero idea about the Drake Kendrick beef. But I mean, I want to understand it actually. I just tuned in, so I missed the chat up to now. But I've seen like snippets about it. But there's just so much going on in the world. I'm sorry. I just haven't had the bandwidth to follow it.
You know what? There is a lot going on in the world, and that is entirely understandable. But actually, funny enough, I am gonna tie this back, believe it or not, and have you talk a little bit about some rap stuff. But I think you'll be prepared for it. But for those unaware, Seb Walker, we're going to be talking about a documentary that you put together. But of course, I know Seb as a longtime correspondent, former colleague of mine at Vice News, bureau chief of the DC bureau, also at Vice News, and now out doing your own thing. And you've just released a documentary called A Hidden War, and that is with Scripps News and Bellingcat. And so this is a documentary that is about Gaza, but you could never actually go into Gaza. You can never actually enter Gaza, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's been the situation since this conflict started. It's actually it's 7 months today since the October 7th attacks, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you're right.
so yeah, it's been, I think frustrating for everybody in my profession to just kind of be on the sidelines and not be able to get in and report as we normally do. It's been kind of unprecedented. So the film is an attempt to do what we can to tell the story, given the restrictions that we're facing.
Yeah. So, you know what? I think maybe the first thing we can do here is just to give people an idea for what they're getting themselves into. I'm going to warn everybody who's watching and listening to. We're going to be talking and showing. It's not going to get too graphic, but look, we're talking about a war here, so there's going to be some pretty disturbing stuff, both shown and audible. So just have that in mind. But this covers a lot of different things. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about how you even went about making this documentary?
For sure. So I think one thing that's interesting about what's happening right now is that there is, in addition to what's happening in Gaza, a kind of parallel conflict that's happening in the West Bank, which is the other area of Palestinian control. And there has been, since October 7th, an escalated number of raids by the IDF, a large rise in violence, largely carried out by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Unprecedented numbers of Palestinians killed and forced from their homes in that other place that's not really getting kind of the same amount of attention. Because really, what's happening in Gaza is just, on a different level. But that was one place we could go. So, kind of continuing the type of, immersive filmmaking we used to do for Vice News, we wanted to, get on the ground and see what was happening, get as close to it as we could. The West Bank is one place where we could go. So a part of the film focuses on that. And we go around speaking to different stakeholders, attending the funeral of a 10-year-old boy who was killed as IDF forces raided his village. We spend time with settlers in one of these outposts. The Biden administration has recently announced a raft of sanctions against settlers and settler outposts in the West Bank. So we wanted to kind of understand the relationship between the settlers and the IDF that's brought a lot of this violence in the last several months. But we also thought it was important, obviously, to try to tell the story in Gaza. So we used different tools for that. I think one of the interesting things about this film is the collaboration we did with Bellingcat, and the open source satellite imagery tools that they have to try to tell a story without being able to get on the ground. So there's parts of this film where we kind of go to this animated section and kind of go to the satellites and the pictures of what's happening on the ground and the data that these guys are able to crunch. Like, the tools that they use are super impressive, and that technology has really evolved in recent years. And it was my first time kind of getting a partnership like that to try to tell this story. So
yeah, well, let's
another way that we write. Yeah,
let's actually take a look at that, actually. So, by the way, this documentary is 43 minutes long, and so what you're going to be hearing and seeing is a very short snippet of that. You're not going to get the full experience. So definitely encourage you to watch the whole thing. We're going to run through a little bit of it here. So let's take a look at this.
In the 6 months following the attack, the Gaza Health Ministry reports more than 32,000 Palestinians were killed, the majority women and children. Gaza now faces one of the worst humanitarian crises the world has ever seen. But it's happening away from the eyes of international media. There's no access except on a very limited basis with Israeli military minders. However, we can see some of what's happening through satellite imagery analyzed by Scripps News and our partners at Bellingcat. The destruction is widespread. Satellite imagery shows mass demolitions in an area where Israel aims to establish a 1 kilometer wide buffer zone over international objections, and along a corridor that bisects the strip from Israel's border to the Mediterranean. Human rights observers have described the devastation as an Israeli military campaign of domicide. That is, the widespread or systematic destruction of homes and civilian infrastructure. In areas around the buffer zone, we can use satellite imagery from Planet Labs to see that hundreds of homes have been flattened. That includes in cities like Huzar and Abasan al-Kabira in Gaza's south. In the so-called Netzarim corridor, hundreds of homes and thousands of acres of agricultural land have been completely cleared by the military. Going even beyond satellite imagery, researchers at 2 American universities have used something called satellite radar, using radar waves from Earth's orbit to map out destruction in the Gaza Strip in detail. As of March 9th, their analysis estimates that 55% of all buildings in Gaza have likely been damaged or destroyed. Estimates from the United Nations say over 650,000 Palestinians, around 30% of Gaza's pre-war population, will have no home to return to. In the last few months, more than a dozen Palestinians have reached out directly to Scripps News to ask if we could check satellite imagery to see if their own homes are still standing.
That is, I mean, there's a couple of things there. One is that it reminds me actually of one of the things that Sarah was talking about when she was talking about Sudan, was that people are doing things like checking Google Earth to see if their homes are still there or what their homes look like, right? But this is even more intense. They're hitting up, you as journalists and saying, hey, you have access to these satellites that maybe not everybody has access to. Can you tell us, is my neighborhood there? Is my old neighborhood there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, those messages were basically on X, where producers had been posting these images from the satellites that had shown kind of a before and after. And, it's over quite a large area. So Palestinians, even like in places like Rafah, like even like literally kind of sheltering from the conflict, were reaching out and asking if, we could find a more micro image that could locate their house and just see whether the structures were still standing. Because there's just such a, for somebody in that situation, there's literally no way of knowing if anything is left from their neighborhood. There often isn't anything left in these towns. I mean, you saw in that animation, there are sometimes places where the Israeli military has effectively kind of erased one of these towns that's often in that area that's close to the border, to create this buffer zone,
right?
Which is against the international law. That's one of the big concerns about the level of destruction, and it's something that we wanted to kind of investigate.
There's one of the really interesting things about this documentary. I encourage you to check it out. If you're watching or listening to this, is that at the risk of sounding a little silly here, is that you actually do hear from both sides as close to one as we could be, right? Which is to say that you hear from Palestinians, you hear from Israelis, you hear from people who do agree with their governments, who do not agree with their governments. For me, it's the closest thing that I've seen to getting a pretty clear, direct voice or a direct line to what are people actually saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting about this moment, today when we're talking, Dexter, is that, there is now, I think, there is certainly in this country, a lot. I mean, we've all seen the campus protests unfolding. There's also been comments from this administration, very strong comments, warning Israel not to go ahead with this assault on Rafah. Mm-hmm. Warning of consequences if they do go ahead. This Netanyahu-led government is still planning to proceed. It seems there's tanks that have just taken a position outside Rafah, like on the other side of the border. That's the latest news from on the ground. So it does look ominously as if this operation will go ahead to clear this area, which currently contains, more than 1 million Palestinians who've been sheltering there as the conflict rages around them. So I think what's interesting in this moment is just like the level of like the critique that is out there from all sides. I mean, we did spend time with Israelis as well, different voices in Israel. I mean, the majority right now, like the large protests that you're seeing in cities like Tel Aviv, are calling for the government to change course, and that does seem to be, the overwork. Like even hostage families that we spoke to were saying that they think the war effort has been mishandled, and that it's not working, and that there should be a change of direction. So that's, I think, something interesting to look at, like what we heard from Israelis about this conflict and what the government should be doing and should not be doing. But yeah, so that's a moment for sure. Yeah, you're seeing those pictures there. That's a protest that we attended in Tel Aviv. I mean, this was some time ago. Those protests have gotten even more extensive, even more like intense since we left. But these guys here are saying, like, really, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has failed with his strategy here, and that he should go. They're calling for new elections.
Yeah. I mean, here I can let us hear a little bit of
Netanyahu, majority of the people of Israel, but all fractions in the government. For them, the main goal of this war is to re-inhabit Gaza. That's definitely not the vision of the vast majority of the people of Israel, but they have a veto power, and Netanyahu cowers to them.
There's a protest against Netanyahu, and then you have soldiers, police coming in and breaking it up.
In polls published on the 6-month anniversary of the war, 71% of Israel's public said they think Prime Minister Netanyahu should step down over his handling of the conflict. A majority also said the government isn't doing enough to bring the hostages home. And we heard the same from the families of the hostages themselves at this demonstration outside Jerusalem.
So who was taken from your family? How many people?
7 people was taken from the safe room. 7, including my son, my grandsons, my granddaughter, My daughter-in-law, her mother, her aunt, and their daughter. My daughter-in-law.
So let me pause here real quick. Even to back up a second, I mean that number 71% that's a lot.
It is, yeah. I mean, there's I think it's probably higher now, a month later. You know, those protests, we've been seeing pictures from Tel Aviv in the last few weeks, where like it's almost a weekly occurrence, these kinds of protests, and they've been getting more and more intense. I mean, there's definitely a strong opposition amongst Israelis for what the government is doing right now on the ground. So this kind of conversation that's happening over here in the US as well, I think it's important to keep in mind what people in Israel themselves are saying about what the government is doing, what the military is doing currently, as they bear down on Rafah, something that is going to have you know untold humanitarian consequences. There's a strong opposition within Israel to that course of action, and that's what we were hearing on the ground. Certainly from a lot of the Israelis that we met. I mean, there's different sectors of opinion. There is a kind of fringe movement that protester that you heard in the piece was talking about, saying that there is, you know, this kind of hardcore settler ideology as well that is, you know, calling for Gaza to be re-inhabited with Israeli settlements in Gaza, and that's
Let's see that here. Yeah. Let's get back to it. Makawi.
My daughter-in-law father was murdered in the same day.
6 of Gilad Korngold's 7 relatives held hostage by Hamas have been released. But his son Tal is still missing. And Korngold says the government's approach isn't working.
We have to do everything that we can to force our government and our people to support us. There's a lot of people. They say, no, hostages is not priority.
But other Israelis think the government isn't being tough enough. Down at the border with Gaza, we found a group of protesters calling for aid to be completely restricted until all the hostages are freed.
So we've got somebody yelling, if Hamas has food, they won't release the hostages, so don't give them food, essentially. So these are people who've showed up to the border, who actually fighting, you know, physically kind of shoving them. You know, we can't say fighting here as in fighting with guns, but, you know, actually getting physical with the guards at the border saying, no, do not let these trucks in. Do not let the food in. And in just a moment here, we'll see, you talk to one of them.
So why do you guys come here today?
להפעיל לחץ על החמאס, להפעיל לחץ על עזה, עד שהם יחזירו את החטופים. חטפו לנו, צריך להחזיר אותם מיד הביתה, לא להעביר סיוע.
But there's kids dying of starvation right now inside Gaza. Don't you feel like they should get food assistance?
חמאס הורג את הילדים. הוא נלחם בנו, שיחזיר את החטופים.
So, and I'm reading some of this out loud so people who aren't looking directly at the screen can hear it. But you know, he's basically saying, listen, Hamas kills kids. If Hamas wants food, they should release the hostages. And that's where it is, where you've got somebody who's actually got somebody who's lost some people and has still has somebody who's being held, potentially is saying, listen, the government is not doing the right thing. So you truly, there is not a consensus is I think what your documentary is showing here, is that there are people who want the government to push harder, and there are people who are saying this is causing harm. This is actually making things worse.
I mean, and I think that's, I mean, just in the last 48 hours, there's been agreement over a deal to free the hostages. Like that's one of the other latest lines from the situation on the ground. There's been, you know, a deal being brokered by Egypt and Qatar where the hostages would be released if the Israeli military withdraws from the Gaza Strip and agrees to a ceasefire. But that deal hasn't been accepted by Israel so far, at least. So that's,
I mean, there's definitely a kind of groundswell of support for bringing this conflict to an end now, and that would be a kind of speedier way for the hostages to be released as well.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we need to underline this is that, you know, Hamas has said, yes, okay, ceasefire. The conditions that have been laid out, we're cool with these. Let's just do this. Agree to it. Israel has said no.
That's what we're hearing. I mean, it's often hard to kind of track the exact kind of discussions and where things are politically, but yeah, those are the latest lines right now. And then there's the question of what's going to happen next with the assault on Rafah. And just the next thing that you see in this film, we go to Rafah and spend time with a Palestinian filmmaker on the ground there who's documenting, you know, the situation, the growing famine in different parts of Gaza. I mean, there's a full-blown famine in the north. There's extreme malnutrition in Rafah itself. And I think one of the big concerns about what happens if the Israeli military goes ahead with this assault on Rafah is that it's going to block one of the main entry points for humanitarian aid, which has been so minimal up to this point that it's going to create an even worse humanitarian situation. And that's the other important thing about this film, is that we wanted to also have, you know, scenes from Gaza. So the Palestinian filmmaker,
what we're seeing is we see both of you going back and forth. I mean, sending each other WhatsApp messages essentially, and then what she would try to mail, you know, essentially send you over video footage when the connection worked. Let's take a look at this.
Just a couple of miles away lies Rafah, where around 1.5 million Palestinians displaced by the fighting are in urgent need of food, medical supplies, and shelter.
ايش اسمك؟ ايش اسمك؟
Now we're just seeing some scenes from inside of Rafah, and there's a
Shrouk Ayla is a Palestinian filmmaker who'd agreed to send us updates on what was happening inside Gaza. Hey Shrouk, it's Sebastian here. I'm right next to the Kerem Shalom crossing. I can see a line of trucks stretching into the distance, loaded with food and medical equipment. There's a group of protesters here. They've been trying to stop the aid from getting in. There's not much that's moving. Tell us what the situation is on your side when you get a chance.
Hey Sebastian, it's Shrouk from Rafah.
Shrouk's signal was so unstable, we mostly talked by sending voice messages. It took days for her video footage to send, and when it arrived, the scenes were harrowing. Images of the growing famine and lack of medical supplies, including basic anesthetic. We'd asked her to talk to families who'd been displaced about what they planned to do next.
And so here is the, you know, as the documentary goes on, we're watching her, you know, speaking to people who are actually inside, who are living here. They have no food, they have no water. How they're, I mean, it's really struggling to even survive. And then, of course, even just walking down the street means walking over pieces of concrete, rubble. It's, yeah.
We've been hearing about the hunger, the need that people have right now. What's the situation right now?
The situation is very bad and worse. Like, people are dying out of starving in the north.
Shrouk has been running her husband's production company by herself for nearly 6 months now. Their family's house was hit by an airstrike in the first 2 weeks of the war. Her husband, Roshdi Siraj, was killed, leaving her to raise their baby daughter alone.
His injury was really severe.
So we decided to, to transfer him to the hospital in Fort. So we carried him.
But he didn't survive.
So sorry, Shrouk.
It's not easy, but
time has to pass.
So just, I mean, that section in there is so
exactly.
heavy.
I mean, it was, so I heard about her story from, I think it was an article in the Washington Post after her husband was killed. In the first 2 weeks of the war, he was pretty established
filmmaker in Gaza, run a production company with a friend of his who was actually killed a few years earlier. And so I'd read about her story. I reached out to the production company, and eventually she got back. But as you can see in that part of the film, like the communications are really difficult. Like we were very rarely able to have a conversation kind of live over WhatsApp. And yeah, sending the material, like the signal is so minimal that it's very hard to upload material from Gaza. And I mean, it's just like the conditions that these journalists have been having to operate in, I mean, for months now have been, just, I can't imagine kind of how you keep going in that situation. And I think that some of the, there's been more than 120 journalists and media workers killed since October 7th in Gaza. There were journalists killed in Israel too. There've been journalists killed in Lebanon. But I think in terms of like the conditions on the ground for doing this kind of work in Gaza, I mean, we haven't seen anything like it. The numbers are unprecedented of journalists who've been getting killed. So, I mean, she's an incredible person. I've been speaking to her over the last few days, just as this kind of threat of an attack on Rafah, heats up, and it's just really, it's just an unimaginable situation. And credit to all of those journalists who've been reporting where we can't. Like no foreign media has been able to get in, except very, very rarely, and often embedded with the Israeli military. So it's really been the Palestinian journalists there who've been doing the lion's share of that reporting.
Yeah, like I said, this documentary takes you back and forth from seeing, what one person's life is like, and then how it's being affected, and then it kind of takes you back and forth between these chains of interconnected people who often don't actually ever see each other. So right after this, we see, somebody who is actually responsible for, by their own admission, the destruction of some of these buildings. And so maybe we can take a look at this now.
Do you feel people will go back to those places after the fighting finishes?
Like, I cannot wait to return.
I know lots of people who lost their homes are making tents
Nowadays, and they said, like, I prefer to get back to my home and establish this tent upon the rubbles of my home.
Shrouk's family's house was in a neighborhood of Gaza City called Tal al-Hawa. Based on satellite data analyzed by Scripps News, that neighborhood was hit at least 30 times in the first month of the war, causing civilian casualties and widespread damage. These airstrikes were only the beginning, though. Once Israel's ground forces reached that area, a different form of destruction came with it. IDF units systematically demolishing buildings and infrastructure, and sometimes posting videos of it to social media.
This part's wild.
And it wasn't just Shrouk's neighborhood. This was a pattern repeated across Gaza, with IDF personnel posting hundreds of these kinds of videos since the war started. Working with Bellingcat, Scripps News was able to establish that many of the demolitions were done by a combat engineering unit called Battalion 8219. And we were able to track their movements across Gaza, from Shrouk's neighborhood in the north to the town of Khuzar, where a large number of buildings were destroyed near the Israeli border. In one video shared by an 8219 member, soldiers can be seen smoking a hookah on a rooftop before conducting a demolition of a large number of houses in Khuzar. Another video, filmed from a similar vantage point, shows the soldiers walking towards the camera and putting on sunglasses as the buildings in the background are blown up. The soldier who shared these videos on Facebook described cleaning the Khuzar homes within the new line, an apparent reference to the buffer zone. He says that a quarter of the homes in the town were destroyed by Battalion 8219.
יש גם ציוד, יש פה לחגורה, 8219. זה משהו שהיחידה...
So you actually found, so the person we're going to speak to, or we're going to see next, is somebody actually in that same exact battalion, and you were able to talk to him. But
yeah, that's right.
Take me back a little bit to the kind of, I mean, the graphics that are in this thing, but you're able actually to go and see and pinpoint, okay, who is blowing these things up. There's actual more or less faces you can put to the destruction.
Yeah, I mean, because so much of it is documented. I mean, that's been a real phenomenon of this conflict, that you know, soldiers on the ground from the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, have been posting to TikTok. They've been posting to Instagram and Facebook. It's been kind of a unique aspect of this conflict where it's just been, there's been so much material that's out there. So when you talk about like open source investigative work that folks like Bellingcat do so effectively, you know, there's a lot to work with. There's these videos of soldiers celebrating the destruction of these buildings. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's been, you know, a huge swath of content uploaded to these platforms. Often making light of the conflict, you know, mocking Palestinians, kind of triumphant cheering and kind of jubilation when a building is destroyed, that kind of thing. We actually went on to ask, you know, an Israeli official about this phenomenon of posting videos, because it doesn't seem to be, you know, something that soldiers should be doing in an active conflict zone. Like, it doesn't seem like it should be, you know, part of the protocol, you know.
Should we watch that? So can we this is an interview that you did. Can you tell me about this person? Who is this we're about to see and hear from right now?
This is a member of the Knesset. So the Knesset is like their Congress. He's a lawmaker. He's from the ruling party, the Likud party, which is also Prime Minister Netanyahu's party. So, you know, this isn't a fringe guy. He's pretty connected to, you know, the ruling coalition. Very connected. In fact, he's part of it. So he's on several security committees. He's, you know, very outspoken, as you're about to see. But yeah, he's essentially one of the Israeli lawmakers who is kind of, you know, at the top of the rung for political leadership of the war effort.
What we're talking about, that they bombed the headquarters of the Hamas, of the guys that raped our women, beheaded our babies.
We were talking about schools and mosques and hospitals.
No, those are mosques that every Friday, during the not only last 17 years of the Hamas occupation, brutal occupation, by the way, that included hundreds of Arabs that were killed by Hamas authorities. These mosques, every Friday, weekly basis, were the voice of destruction. Hey, kill Jews. You see the stone says, you see the Jew is behind me, kill him. This is this mosque. This mosque should be destroyed. This is not the mosque.
But that's illegal under international law. You can't destroy a building based on that justification. If
this building is part of the enemy infrastructure, so it's not a mosque. This is infidel building. It's not about all those good values, by the way, in the Muslim world, like.
But if there's no military basis to destroy it, then that's not in accordance with international law.
If these buildings serve the military operation of your enemy, you can hit it, you can destroy it, and this is under the international law.
Halavi was criticized for saying in a Knesset...
It seems like what's happening here is we're just redefining It's like saying, okay, well, you say it's a mosque. Well, I say it's a base of military operations. And so it seems like the move here is simply to say, well, that's not a mosque. That's a military base. And if you define it as a military base, well, then of course it's legal to bomb it because that's
you're totally right,
target.
Dexter. Like you can essentially use that justification for kind of any building, right? Like if that's, essentially what he was saying was that a mosque that previous to October 7th, where the muezzin, the people in the mosque were saying things against Israel, that would give legitimacy to destroying that mosque as part of this war effort. And the war effort is supposed to be about eradicating Hamas and freeing the hostages. So kind of like expanding it to just kind of getting rid of any, structure that had any kind of connection to, anti-Israel kind of viewpoint doesn't add up. That's certainly not within the bounds of international law, but it's kind of eye-opening that the guy, one of the guys in charge essentially is saying that there's no problem there, like there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that speaks to some of what we're seeing on the ground, some of the ways that the soldiers are operating on the ground that are raising so many questions, around the world. Like that kind of logic doesn't really hold. And it's incredibly problematic. Like if you think back to, the families that we saw sheltering in Rafah, these are people who expect and want to go back to these places that they've evacuated. But a lot of that is not going to exist anymore. Like the level of destruction is so intense, partly because of what you heard from that interview. So that's stuff that we were trying to dig into and try to get a kind of a clear picture of, but it's been so hard, Dexter. It's like it's been impossible really for us as foreign journalists to get a kind of forensic investigative view of what's going on the ground. I mean, the Palestinian journalists themselves have been unable to reach many of these areas, have been killed while trying to reach these areas. So it's really kind of happening out of sight. I mean, we call this film a hidden war and part of that is because this is unfolding away from scrutiny, away from the questions that would normally kind of be raised by journalists on the ground, kind of poring over these sites where bombs have been dropped or buildings destroyed. Like that process isn't happening right now, and that's dangerous.
Yeah. Let's hear a little bit more from this person here. There's a second half of this interview here.
Under the international law.
Halavi was criticized for saying in a Knesset hearing in October that a goal for the IDF in Gaza should be that there is no more Muslim land in the land of Israel.
I think we need to do some activities in order to make the world remembrance on what happened in October 7. I didn't say genocide, never.
No, but you've said there should be no more Muslim land.
Land.
And that Gaza should be left as a monument.
Ege, one second.
What do you mean by that?
I will tell you exactly.
As a monument.
One, there is no Muslim land in the state of Israel. There is no Muslim land. The land is not Muslim. The land is the land of Israel.
What about those Palestinians who've been pushed out of the areas that have been destroyed in the north? Should they be able to return to these areas and rebuild?
First of all, now we are in the middle of a war. And war is not game. I mean, our soldiers there in order to whip out all the Hamas soldiers and Hamas actors there. And second, I must tell you, there are not a lot of innocent people there.
Okay. There are not a lot of innocent people there. So this is something that various people tell you in the course of this documentary. And you hear it from one of the people who's protesting, saying that they should get no aid. You ask somebody, hey, there's children there, they're dying, they're starving, shouldn't they have food? And they say, well, if Hamas wants to help them, well, then they should release the hostages. And there's a couple of the people I believe that you speak to say something very similar, which is that they all basically they're all terrorists essentially, or they are either terrorists or they support terrorists. I think it's different when if it's coming from an individual person, a civilian. That's one thing. Of course, there are people out there that think this. It's different when it comes from a member of the ruling party. When they say there's not a lot of innocent people there. You didn't ask this question, by the way. You didn't say, hey, what about the innocent people? He just added it. What were you thinking when he told you that?
It's just incredibly dangerous. Like you're saying, Dexter, if that comes from somebody in his position, then that has an impact. That kind of helps to shape opinion in other sectors of the population, and I think that mindset is really kind of consequential in terms of driving some of the things that we see happening on the ground. And it kind of speaks to this idea that everybody in Gaza has some responsibility for the horror of what happened on October 7th. Like that's not rooted in reality. That kind of thinking is used to justify some of the human costs that we've been seeing, and it's not based in fact, and it's irresponsible, frankly, from someone in his position to be saying things like that. And I think the worry is, if that is a real kind of opinion at the highest levels of the government, the political leadership, then to what extent is that part of the strategy that we're seeing from the military? Like, to what extent are soldiers kind of operating with that kind of mindset as well? And I think those are very important questions. And it was pretty eye-opening for me to sit in front of him and kind of hear that type of language. Like I wasn't expecting that, and maybe that was naive, but I was kind of surprised. And after that interview, we cut back to our collaborator in Gaza, Shrouk, and just kind of check back in with her before leaving. And it's really kind of like, there's 1 million people in Rafah right now, more than 1 million people, and the numbers of those killed, it's mostly been women and children. There's been more than 14,000 children killed, and like that's like the idea that there's kind of some responsibility from the civilian population of Gaza for what happened on October 7th is gonna, like, that's highly problematic, and that's very kind of uncomfortable to hear from a member of the ruling party. So yeah, it was kind of dispiriting.
With the sort of statement, and it's not like that statement is the first time that anybody Palestinian has heard something like that. This is you've got somebody saying on tape something that is very similar to things that have been said before by numerous other people in the party, and who are not, obviously in the ruling party, but the not only the actions and the words are, I think, what does one think is going to happen after that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Dexter. Things like that, and there's been, documented instances of that from different members of the Israeli government. But yeah, you're like, it was just kind of mind blowing to hear it in person. But you're right. This is something we've been hearing.
What could possibly be positive about the outcome of this? I think about and maybe this is just because of my past, but I think about the fact that I think all 13 universities have been destroyed. It's like, if there are no, again, maybe I'm thinking too far down the line here, but if there are no opportunities for people to do something positive, what do you think is going to happen? If you truly do believe that all of these people pose a danger to you, okay, let's take that at face value. Now there's no schools. What positive ideology is going to come out of that? Again, this is taking everything that's being said at face value, but still.
Totally. And no, and I think these questions are now like there's a I think this is part of what we're seeing with these protests on campuses across the US. I mean, the fact that the destruction of the universities is something that I've heard from these student protesters, kind of asking for more attention to be paid and asking for a change of course from, the US government as it relates to this conflict. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. And it's also like, I think it's going to become a pretty important election issue as well in some ways. Like,
so
this is going to be
let's talk about that.
Something
actually,
that's spoken about on the trail. Yeah.
I have something I want to bring up actually. So I said that I was going to make you talk about Kendrick Lamar versus Drake. And I am actually. So what I want to do right now, are you familiar with Macklemore?
I am. And I've seen this video.
You've seen the video. Okay.
I'm glad you brought this up.
Let's play this because for those who are unaware, Kendrick and Drake have been going back and forth, and that has been, if you look online, depending on what circles you run in, a lot of people, the conflict that they're paying attention to is Kendrick versus Drake. That's the conflict. And hey, that's fine. That's okay. And then this piece drops. So we're just going to go and listen to it right now. And there's a video. This is Macklemore.
Yeah. The people, they won't leave. What is threatening about divesting and want a piece? The problem isn't the protest, it's what they're protesting. It goes against what our country is funding. Block the barricade until Palestine is free. Block the barricade until Palestine is free. When I was 7, I learned a lesson from Cuban Eazy-E. What was it again? Oh yeah, fuck the police. Actors and badges protecting property in a system that was designed by white supremacy. But the people are in the streets. You can pay off Meta, you can't pay off me. Politicians who serve by any means. APAC, Kufi, and all the companies. You see, we sell beer around the land of the free. But this generation here is about to cut the strings. You can ban TikTok, take us out the algorithm, but it's too late. We've seen the truth, we bear witness. Seen the rubble, the buildings, the mothers and the children, and all the men that you murdered. And then we see how you spin it. Who gets the right to defend and who gets the right of resistance. Has always been about dollars and the color of your pigment. But white supremacy is finally on blast, screaming free Palestine to their home at last. We see the lies and claiming it's anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist. I seen Jewish brothers and sisters out there and riding in solidarity and screaming free Palestine, with them organizing and learning and finally cutting ties with the state that's gotta rely on apartheid system to uphold and occupying violent history. Been repeating for the last 75. The Nakba never ended, the colonizer lied. If students' intents posted on the lawn, occupying the quad is really against the law. And a reason to call in the police and their squad. Where does genocide land in your definition, huh? Destroying every college in Gaza and every mosque. Pushing everyone into Rafah and dropping bombs. The blood is on your hands, Biden, we can see it all. And fuck no, I'm not voting for you in the fall. Undecided, you can't twist the truth, the people out here unite.
I just wanted to pause right there because that was a big line right there, but let us keep going.
Never be defeated when freedom's on the horizon. Yet the music industry's quiet, complicit in their platform of silence. What happened to the artist? What you gotta say? If I was on a label, you could drop me today. I'll be fine with it cause the heart fed my page. I want a ceasefire, fuck a response from Drake. What you willing to risk? What you willing to give? What if you were in Gaza? What if those were your kids? If the West was pretending that you didn't exist, you want the world to stand up, and the students finally did. Let's get it.
Okay. So you've seen this already. So this makes the conversation shorter then. So once again, while everybody was really truly paying attention to Drake and Kendrick, I was too. Macklemore, who I know most for a few things, but making a song about buying clothes from the thrift shop. I was never a fan of Macklemore, by the way, as a rapper. Drops in with this. I'm very curious as to your thoughts about this, specifically because we were talking about the protests, and he's directly referencing the protests, and he talks about Biden. So
yeah, I mean, I saw this I think a couple of days ago, and I thought you would bring it up, and I'm glad you have. I mean, the question, I think the way you paused it there about his line, "I'm not voting for Biden."
Yeah.
Like that's going to be, I think, a central question following on from these protests, following on from how the administration is, responding to those and talking about those. And I think it's something, it's going to be, there's going to be a significant part of, I think, people's decisions around Gaza, like around what they think about the administration's policy towards Israel and towards this conflict, and I think that's summed up in this video. I mean, he's turned it around pretty quick. Like some of those videos from the encampments, very recent stuff. So sounds like that must have been produced quite quickly. But I mean, I'm talking to you now just about 20 blocks away from Colombia, and I mean, it's been a huge story that's unfolding because this is a new generation of voters, and I think it's been, it's been for someone who's focused on Middle East coverage, it's been pretty heartening to see just how engaged this generation is on this issue, and I think it's there's been some great journalism as well that's been done from the student journalists covering these encampments, and I think it's again, like in Israel too, a lot of the people in the streets were young people, like people who are getting out and calling for their political leaders to listen more, to engage more on changing, like, conversations about policy and changing course. Like, I think there's a parallel there, and I think this generation is a lot more engaged, and it's good to see. People are asking more questions now about U.S. policy. Like, is it really the correct kind of the amount of military aid that the U.S. sends Israel versus how much Israel actually pays attention and heeds what U.S. politicians are asking them to do. I think that's been a big question recently, and I think this generation is driving a lot of that. Like that could be a crucial part of the electorate come November, and I think the White House kind of is paying attention to some degree. It remains to be seen how much they're going to listen or be directed by those protests, but and I think they're kind of struggling right now to decide like which direction to go, and I think there'll be consequences either way. So it's going to be a really interesting thing to follow as the campaign heats up over the coming months, and I'm certainly looking very closely at how the Biden administration is messaging around it, and real policy stuff. Like this U.S. policy in the Middle East has a huge impact. I mean, that was eye-opening to me on the ground as well. Like the Israelis and Palestinians that we met still, look to the U.S. and U.S. policymakers as kind of a significant, factor in the conflict. Like there's real impact that that's can have, and I think the scrutiny that the policy is getting right now is healthy.
If you're looking at the conversations that you're seeing, right? One of the things that I've seen a lot of student protesters complaining about is that we seem to be focusing on the student protesters and not what they're protesting about. And that the articles that are written and the media coverage that's done is about, hey, why are these kids are here and they're making a racket and they're messing stuff up and now they're fighting and what's going on? Why can't we just go home? And nobody's actually talking about, okay, wait a second, why are you here again? How do you think, and this is, I suppose, the opportunity to talk about our own profession, how are we doing as journalists and as a media landscape, and how informed do you think people outside of this region are, you know, whether in the States, whether in the UK, whether they're, you know, wherever in Europe? How well do you think we're doing with actually understanding not only what's happening on college campuses, but what it is that they are talking about?
I think we're doing terribly, Dexter. That's been obvious in the discourse is that, like, there is, I mean, the media coverage of these protests, I think, has been, I mean, one thing you're pinpointing there is that it's kind of sucked all the energy from coverage of the issue writ large. Like, in the last couple of weeks, there's been, you know, way less attention on, you know, the actual conflict and the people who are being impacted by that, because there's been this, you know, kind of horse race approach with talking heads, like pro and counter on, you know, should people be protesting in this way, like that kind of inward looking, kind of disconnected way that the mainstream media covers this stuff in the US. I think it's just highlighting once again that there isn't really something that, I mean, I don't know how many of these student protesters actually pay attention to anything that the mainstream media kind of does. Like, I just don't think that they consume any of that stuff. Like, they get their information from other places, and I don't think there is really a good, solid, consistent place to get that information. I mean, there's so much disinformation that's out there.
We used to work at one of them, but
flying around, and, you know, you're really feeling that loss right now. Like, I just don't think there has been a place for that generation to kind of get a reliable source of news recently, and I think that's a problem. And what it means for coverage of the region, it just becomes this kind of partisan conversation that is kind of mindless and doesn't really address the issues. It doesn't really resonate with anyone under the age of 50, and it doesn't really kind of inform. It just kind of echoes around these different, like, partisan chambers, and nobody, like, fewer and fewer people are paying attention to it, and I think that's the crisis that our industry has. Like,
you seen Hind's post today?
I haven't seen it.
You haven't? You heard about the Pulitzer?
Yes.
Hind brought up, so shout out to Hind. You know, big fan of the show. Hopefully you have her back on soon. But, you know, she made a really, I think, really insightful post here that some people might not be aware of, is a special citation for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize is given to journalists and media workers covering the war in Gaza, which sounds great. That sounds amazing. I mean, hey, you get one, Seb. That's amazing. Lots of people get. Who doesn't want a Pulitzer, right? But as she breaks down here, though, the language was different for Ukraine. It was the journalists of Ukraine, right? And Afghanistan, same thing.
Journalists that have covered the Gaza conflict, rather than journalists in Gaza, journalists of Gaza, which is a difference from what the Pulitzer said about, you know, the journalists in Ukraine or the journalists in Afghanistan.
And it might seem like we're splitting hairs here, but we are in a business in which we are we have copy editors, we have editors. We are very good at writing. We understand how to read between the lines and over and under the lines. And so we're not respecting the people who are, the argument here is we're not respecting people who are behind the lines, who are living in the areas, and they're writing about their own, their own situations, their own homes. And okay, if we bestow that honor upon people in Ukraine, why are we not doing this for the people who are telling us what is happening in Gaza? And, you know, Hind, and, you know, I'll leave this post in here, but you can, of course, anybody can read it themselves. But I think maybe the most important part of what Hind writes here is that to be a Palestinian or Arab journalist is apparently a political act. It is a reflection of just how controversial their mere existence is. And I mean, it's a hard sentence to read, but
yeah, I mean, I think that language matters, and this kind of thing does matter. It's it might not sound like a kind of major difference, but yeah, reading between the lines, knowing what we know about how these awards work and, you know, how people are cited or honored, it's a double standard, and I think Hind's right to point that out for sure. And it's not the first instance of this either, you know.
It is interesting that, and I think this should always happen, that we're in a moment now where I think journalists were having to think about the kind of work that we do and how we do it and who it is for. And, you know, with the understanding, of course, that journalism is being defunded, is being attacked left, right, and center, you know, mostly right, maybe center also. But, you know, it's a weird position to be in, but I think it's, at the very least, it's an opportunity to keep thinking about what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, totally.
You know,
and it can still have tremendous impact, you know, and I think that's why we all kind of continue doing this kind of work. Like it's, we put out this film and you know, it meant a lot to the people that we met on the ground, and I mean, to the Palestinian filmmaker Shru Gala, you know, it meant a lot to have, you know, a platform and a voice that can kind of reach out to American viewers and get her story across. So I think it's still really important, and we just need to listen to, you know, the next generation about what they're interested in, what they're focused on, and kind of be responsive to that, and kind of tell, like, work for that generation as well. You know, they have a much more engaged kind of mindset, and I think it's important to be thoughtful and responsive to that, and kind of take it into account when we're planning what stories to do or what kind of coverage is important. You know, that's what we try to do at Vice, and I think people still really want that.
Yeah, no, people still want it, and you know, and clearly people care about what's happening in other parts of the world, even Americans. Who knew? Clearly, we're interested. So even that, hopefully keep.
Yeah, that's really been brought home in the last few months, and it's good to see, you know, because it's important.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you so much for coming through.
It's really good to be here. Good to see you doing this, Dex, and really appreciate the time. And
absolutely, man. Absolutely. Well, yo, thanks once again for coming through, and we'll have you on hopefully sometime soon, man.
Sounds good. All right. Take care. Easy, I'm going to listen to that Drake and Kendrick.
Awesome. Don't get too sad. Take it easy, man.